There's a moment, and I've thought about this more times than I can count, when you realize you're watching something that wasn't meant for your eyes. Not a secret exactly, not something hidden behind closed doors or whispered in back corridors, just a moment that belongs to somebody else. A private moment that somehow spilled out into the open, like ink bleeding through paper, and once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. That's what the morning of the 14th felt like. I'd been standing near the East Gate for just over 2 hours by then. 2 hours and roughly 11 minutes if you want the precise number, because I'd checked my watch when I arrived, and I checked it again when everything started to change. Old habit. My father was a clockmaker. He always said that the exact time something happens matters, that a story without a timestamp is just gossip. So 2 hours and 11 minutes. The weather that morning was the kind that London does better than anywhere else on Earth. Not quite raining, not quite not raining. That gray suspended mist that softens all the edges and makes everything look like a watercolor that hasn't dried yet. The kind of morning where you pull your coat collar up not because you're cold exactly, but because the air is pressing against you in that damp, insistent way. The tourists around me had done the same thing, one by one, without saying a word to each other. Strangers adjusting their collars in unison, very British in its own way. There were perhaps 40 of us gathered along that section of the path. Maybe more. People come and go, that's the thing about standing near the palace on any given morning. A cluster forms, disperses, reforms. Japanese tourists with proper camera equipment, the long lenses that cost more than my monthly rent. An American couple who kept trying to get a shot without the iron railings in frame and kept failing and kept trying anyway. 2 teenage girls from what sounded like somewhere in the north of England, sharing earphones from a single phone, half watching the guard and half watching something on the screen. A man in a very orange waterproof jacket who looked like he'd taken a wrong turn somewhere and wasn't entirely sure how he'd ended up here. And me. I was there because of work, technically. I write for a small heritage publication, nothing grand, nothing you'd have heard of, and I'd been commissioned to do a piece about the changing of the guard ceremony and what it means to the people who come to watch it. A human interest piece, my editor called it. He likes that phrase. Human interest, as if there's any other kind of interest worth having. So I was watching. That's my job most days, standing somewhere and watching and writing down what I see. And what I saw that morning for the first 2 hours and 11 minutes was more or less what you'd expect. The guard was stationed at his post with the particular stillness that never stops being impressive, no matter how many times you've seen it. I want to be careful here not to make it sound like a performance because it isn't. That's what people misunderstand. When you watch a royal guard stand still, you're watching a man exercise an extraordinary level of internal discipline. He's not switched off. He's not somewhere else in his mind. He's entirely, completely present, controlling every small movement his body wants to make, every instinct, every reflex. He's choosing, actively in every single second, to remain exactly where he is and exactly how he is. His name, I learned this afterward, from a colleague who knew someone, as these things always go, was Corporal James Whitmore, 26 years old, from somewhere near Exeter. Joined up at 18 because his uncle had served and because, as he apparently told people sometimes, he wanted to do something that mattered. But I didn't know his name that morning. He was just the guard to me. Tall, completely still, the bearskin hat making him taller still, the ceremonial rifle at his side, eyes forward, exactly as he should be. The first unusual thing I noticed wasn't dramatic. It was small. The kind of thing you notice and then file away under probably nothing and then forget, except that morning I didn't forget. I noticed it and something in me stayed alert. It was a sound. Not a loud sound, not a sharp sound. Just a small, soft, slightly bewildered sound coming from somewhere to the left of the main gate, low to the ground. The kind of sound that, if you heard it in your kitchen or in your back garden, you'd know immediately what it was. A dog. Not barking, just vocalizing. That small, throaty sound dogs make when they're uncertain or when they want something or when they've lost their bearings and are trying to figure out where they are. Several people around me looked up from their phones. The 2 northern girls pulled out their shared earphone. The man in the orange jacket craned his neck. And then I saw her. She came around the corner of the path from the direction of the side entrance, the one that doesn't get much foot traffic at that hour, the one that's more functional than decorative. She was moving quickly, which is the first thing you'd notice. not running. Royals don't run, not in that particular sense. But there's a purposeful velocity that the people around them develop when something has gone slightly wrong, and the small group around her had that velocity now. Camilla, I want to pause here and be very clear about something because I think it matters. I was not expecting to see her. There had been nothing in the papers that morning, nothing on any of the usual channels, nothing to suggest she'd be at this particular location at this particular time. Whatever had brought her here, it hadn't been announced. She was dressed simply, dark coat. Hair done because her hair is always done, but the overall impression was of someone who had left somewhere in a hurry, or who had come somewhere with a very specific purpose and wasn't here for ceremony. There were 2 aides with her. 2 protection officers, moving with that particular alert ease that protection officers have mastered, present without being obtrusive. And the sound was coming from ahead of her. Low, throaty, uncertain. I pushed forward slightly, gently, not rudely, just enough, and then I saw the dog. Small and golden cream colored, with the particular compressed-looking face, and the sturdy little body, and the outsized personality that breed always seems to carry around with them like a piece of luggage. Moving in that slightly unsteady way, not quite lost, not quite found, sniffing at the gravel path with tremendous concentration, oblivious to everything except whatever scent it was following. A Corgi. And not just any Corgi. The older man standing 3 people to my right, white-haired, military bearing, the kind of man who reads the Telegraph front to back every morning before he does anything else, made a sound. Not a word, just a sound. An intake of breath that was also somehow an exhalation, if that makes any sense. The sound of recognition mixed with something heavier. He started and then stopped. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Because by then I'd seen the tag on the collar, glinting in the gray morning light, and I'd seen the particular way Camilla had stopped walking. Not because someone had stopped her, not because of any physical barrier, but because she'd seen the dog too, and whatever that meant to her in that moment had momentarily overridden her forward momentum. The dog's name was Sandy. Sandy had belonged to the Queen. Let me give you some context, because context matters here more than it usually does. After Her Majesty passed, and that morning in September 2022 is one of those mornings that people will always remember exactly where they were. There had been considerable and rather public discussion about what would happen to the Corgis. The Queen had been devoted to the breed her entire adult life. The dogs were as much a part of her public image as the handbags, as the wave, as the particular shade of green she favored. When she died, people grieved the Corgis almost as a separate category of grief, which sounds strange until you understand that for many people, the dogs represented something specific, the private person behind the public role. The woman who loved her animals with uncomplicated, unceremonious warmth. Sandy and Muick, the 2 Corgis who had been at Balmoral when the Queen died, were subsequently taken in by Prince Andrew and his former wife Sarah. This had been reported. This was public knowledge. What wasn't public knowledge, what I didn't know that morning and didn't learn until later, was the particular sequence of events that had brought Sandy to this specific path on this specific morning. What I knew in the moment was only what I could see. The dog, the path, Camilla standing very still. And Corporal James Whitmore, the guard, who had also, I was almost certain of it, seen the dog. Here's the thing about royal guards that most people don't understand. The stillness is real. The discipline is real, but the awareness is also real. He sees everything. He registers everything. Every movement, every sound, every small deviation from the expected pattern of the morning. He has to. That's not the ceremonial part of the job. That's the actual job, the one underneath the uniform and the bearskin hat. He had seen the dog. And the dog, with the cheerful, slightly chaotic logic that dogs operate on, had noticed the guard. Sandy stopped sniffing the gravel, lifted her head, looked at Corporal Whitmore with those dark, bright eyes that Corgis have, eyes that always look like they know more than they're letting on. And then she began to move toward him. Not running, not bounding, just trotting with the calm certainty of a dog who has been around people her entire life and knows, at some deep instinctive level, what a person in uniform means, what it smells like, what it represents. The Queen had spent her whole life surrounded by people in uniform. So had her dogs. One of Camilla's aides moved forward, a quick, reflexive movement, reaching toward the dog. And Corporal Whitmore did something. It was small. It was technically almost nothing. A fraction of a degree of movement, the faintest adjustment of his posture, not breaking his formal position, not moving his feet, not deviating in any way that would be visible on a photograph. But it was unmistakable to anyone who was close enough and paying attention. He was allowing the dog to approach. The aide stopped. I don't know exactly why. Maybe she read something in the stillness of the guard that told her this was not the right moment to intervene. Maybe she looked at Camilla and saw something in Camilla's face that made her pull back. Maybe she just understood, the way people in those roles develop an understanding for these things, that what was happening needed to be allowed to happen. Sandy reached the guard, sniffed at his boot first, then his trouser leg. Then, and I don't know how else to describe this, she simply sat down next to him, right next to him, close enough that her small golden body was almost touching his leg. And she looked up at him, and then she looked out at the path, and then she looked up at him again. Like she'd found something she'd been looking for. The crowd around me had gone very quiet. I mean genuinely quiet, not hushed, not respectful quiet, but the kind of quiet that happens when a group of strangers collectively stops breathing for a second because they're watching something they don't quite have words for. I looked at Camilla. She was looking at the dog. And her face did something that I think she probably didn't intend anyone to see. Something that moved across it quickly, like a shadow, before she composed herself again. Something that was not grief exactly, not the public grief of someone who knows they're being watched, but the private kind. The small, sudden, catching kind. The kind that comes when something unexpected reminds you of someone you've lost, and for one unguarded second, it's right there on your face before you can stop it. She had loved the Queen. Whatever the complications of royal life, whatever the histories and the tensions and the things that newspapers speculate about endlessly, she had loved her. And there was the dog, sitting quietly beside a guard, looking out at the morning, and it was the kind of moment that doesn't need an explanation and can't really be improved by one. I wrote in my notes, later that afternoon. She stood very still and she looked at the dog and she let herself feel something. That's what I wrote. I stand by it. The moment lasted perhaps 40 seconds. Then Camilla moved forward. And this is where the morning shifted. This is where the story became the story I'm still thinking about. Because one of the aides moved with her and said something, low and quick, something I couldn't hear from where I was standing. And Camilla stopped. The aide said something else, pointed barely perceptibly toward the gate ahead. And I understood, or I thought I understood, that there was some issue with the route. Some logistical problem. Some reason why the path Camilla was proposing to take at that moment was not the path she was supposed to take. She paused. She looked at the dog again. And then she did something that surprised me. She turned and looked directly at the guard. I need to tell you something about the way time moves at moments like that. It doesn't slow down. That's a myth, the slow-motion dramatic pause that films have trained us to expect. What actually happens is something stranger. Time becomes more dense, more full. Like each second contains more information than a second usually holds, and your mind is trying to process all of it at once, and the effort of that processing gives the impression of expansion. 40 seconds, that's all it was. But in those 40 seconds, I noticed things I wouldn't normally notice. The sound of a pigeon landing on the iron railing to my left. The fact that the American couple had stopped trying to take their photograph. The way the mist had begun, almost imperceptibly, to thin, the way London mist sometimes does, as if the city is deciding, reluctantly, to allow a little more light. And I noticed Corporal Whitmore's hands. He was holding the ceremonial rifle in the prescribed position. I won't go into the exact technical details because I'm not a military person and I'd likely get something wrong. But I noticed his hands, the way they were holding the weight of the thing, the particular set of them. And I thought, this is a man who is choosing, right now, in this exact moment, not to move. Not because he can't, not because he's forgotten how, but because he's decided that this is the right thing to do. That sounds simple. It isn't simple. He was a young man, 26, as I said, standing at a post near a royal palace, in full ceremonial dress, in the presence of a member of the royal family, with a corgi belonging to the late queen sitting directly beside his boot. There were tourists watching. There were cameras pointed in his general direction. There were aides nearby who probably had opinions about how the next 30 seconds should proceed. And he stood still. Not frozen, still, there's a difference. Frozen is when you can't move, still is when you've decided not to. He stood still, and he let the morning be what it was. The aide who had stopped Camilla was a woman of perhaps 50, dark-haired, very composed in the way that people who work in those roles learn to be composed. I learned later, much later, through the same chain of acquaintance that gave me Whitmore's name, that her name was Patricia, and that she'd worked in royal household administration for nearly 2 decades. She knew the protocols. She knew the routes and the timings and the 1,000 small requirements that govern how a member of the royal family moves through a space. What she was telling Camilla I pieced together afterward was this. The path ahead, the path Camilla had been intending to take, was not yet cleared. There were people ahead, more people than had been anticipated. There was a vehicle that wasn't supposed to be where it was. Small logistical complications, the kind that happen all the time and are usually resolved invisibly, but which in this case meant that the route needed a few more minutes. Standard, routine, not a crisis, just a pause. Except that the pause placed Camilla exactly here. Exactly in this spot. With this dog. There's a kind of logic to life that isn't really logic at all. More like pattern. More like the thing you notice when you look back at a sequence of events and see that something was moving toward something else all along, even when none of the individual moments seemed connected. I'm not a mystical person, I'm really not. I write heritage pieces for a small publication, I collect facts, I check things twice. I am deeply, constitutionally skeptical of the idea that the universe arranges things. But I found it hard, standing there that morning, watching Camilla look at Sandy while Sandy sat beside the guard as if she'd always been there, to shake the feeling that something had been arranged. Not by the universe, not by anything grand, just by the small, sideways movement of ordinary things bumping up against each other. A vehicle in the wrong place. A gate not yet cleared. A dog that followed a scent to a particular patch of gravel. A guard who chose stillness. These things added up to this. Camilla looked at the guard. And then she looked at Patricia and said something, not sharply, not irritably, just something quiet and clear, and Patricia stepped back. And Camilla walked toward Sandy. I want to describe this carefully because I think the detail matters. She didn't rush. She didn't call the dog's name in the bright, performative way that people sometimes call dogs when they know they're being watched. She just walked toward Sandy with the particular steadiness of someone who knows animals, who is comfortable with them, who doesn't need to announce themselves. She stopped about a meter away. Sandy looked at her. And here is the thing. Sandy didn't move toward her immediately. She didn't bound forward with the uncritical enthusiasm that dogs sometimes show. She looked at Camilla with those sharp, dark eyes for what felt like a long time. It was probably 3 or 4 seconds, with the particular canine seriousness that looks almost like consideration. Then she got up. She walked the meter between them, and she put her head against Camilla's hand. The crowd was still very quiet. I was writing in my notebook, but I wasn't looking at my notebook. I was doing that thing where your hand moves by itself while your eyes stay on what's in front of you. I've looked back at what I wrote during those minutes, and the handwriting is awful, nothing I could actually use in the piece, just fragments. Dog approaches, doesn't run, something careful about it. CM stands very still. I don't know how long the moment lasted. Long enough that the mist definitely started to break. A stripe of weak winter sun came through from the southeast, caught the gravel path, caught the gold of Sandy's coat. Long enough that the pigeon on the railing lost interest and flew away. Long enough that the 2 northern girls who had been whispering to each other went quiet. Camilla had one hand on Sandy's head. Her face was turned slightly away from the crowd, whether deliberately or not I couldn't tell. But the set of her shoulders, the way she was holding herself, the particular quality of her stillness, it reminded me of the way people stand in churches. Not religious stillness exactly, just interior, turned inward, present with something that isn't available for public comment. One of the protection officers had moved slightly, a subtle repositioning that gave Camilla a degree of privacy without anyone having to say the word privacy. These people are extraordinarily good at their job. And Corporal Whitmore was still standing exactly where he'd been standing. And I noticed this, I wrote it down, he had shifted his eyes. Just fractionally. Just the smallest possible movement of his gaze, so small that on any photograph it would be invisible. He was looking at her. Not staring, not watching. Looking in the way you look at something when you want to witness it properly, when you want to carry the memory of it. He was 26 years old. He was from near Exeter. He had joined up because he wanted to do something that mattered. I think, standing there that morning, he understood that he was doing something that mattered. The logistical problem ahead resolved itself. I became aware of this before Camilla did, or at least before she responded to it, because I saw Patricia receive something, a brief communication through an earpiece, the tiniest nod of confirmation. The vehicle had been moved. The gate was clear. The route was ready. Patricia moved forward. She said something to Camilla. Camilla looked up from Sandy. And then she did something that, I want to get this exactly right, because I've replayed it many times and I want to describe it accurately. She looked at Whitmore. Not the quick, dutiful acknowledgement that public figures sometimes give to people in roles. Not performative. She looked at him the way you look at someone when you want to say something that you don't have the words for, or that isn't appropriate to say out loud, or that would take too long to say properly. She looked at him for a second, maybe two, and then she gave the smallest possible nod. It wasn't a royal nod, not the formal acknowledgement. It was a human nod, the kind between two people who have just shared something that neither of them will talk about later. Whitmore, to his credit, to his extraordinary disciplined credit, didn't move, didn't respond in any visible way. He held his position exactly as he was supposed to. But I was close, and I was watching. And I thought I saw, I can't be certain, I can only tell you what I thought I saw. I thought I saw something shift in his face for just a fraction of a second. Something that might, in a different context, in a different uniform, have been the beginning of a smile. Then it was gone. Then he was the guard again. And Camilla was walking forward toward the cleared path, toward wherever she was going. And Sandy was still sitting on the gravel, watching her leave, with the patient, slightly baffled expression that dogs have when something they wanted has walked away. After she left, it took the crowd a few minutes to recalibrate. That's the only word I have for it, recalibrate. We'd all been tuned to the same frequency, that strange, shared attentiveness that crowds develop when they're all watching the same thing. And then the thing ended, and the frequency broke, and people started moving again, started talking, started lifting their phones. The American couple went back to trying to photograph the gate without the railings. The man in the orange jacket wandered off somewhere. The two northern girls started talking to each other, quickly and quietly, with the specific animation of people processing something they've just seen. The older man next to me, the one with the military bearing and the telegraph face, let out a long breath. "Well," he said. "Not to me particularly, just to the air." "Well," he said again, and I think that covered it. I stayed. This is not unusual for me. I tend to stay after things happen, stand in the space where the thing was, see if there's anything left in the air. My editor thinks this is a waste of time. My editor is probably right, but I keep doing it. The gravel where Sandy had sat still showed the slight indentation of her small weight. I looked at it for longer than was strictly reasonable. Then I looked at Whitmore. He was exactly as he'd been when I arrived, exactly as he should be. The bearskin hat, the rifle, the eyes forward, the complete and practiced stillness. If you'd arrived at that gate at that moment, having seen none of what preceded it, you'd have seen only what you were supposed to see, a guard doing his job in the gray London morning. But I had seen what preceded it. I want to tell you something about grief. Not because I'm an expert, I'm really not, but because grief was in the air that morning in a way that I think deserves to be named. It had been more than a year since the Queen died. More than a year of the country going about its business, adjusting, recalibrating, learning the rhythms of something new. The way all countries do after they lose a figure who's been part of the furniture for so long that the furniture, ness of them, becomes invisible, until suddenly it isn't there anymore and the room looks strange. Grief doesn't follow a schedule. It doesn't comply with timelines or anniversaries. It shows up in the texture of ordinary mornings, in unexpected dogs on unexpected paths, in the small nod of a woman to a young guard on a gray day when the mist is just starting to break. I thought about what it means to carry something like that. To be the queen consort, to be queen now, and to walk through a world that your predecessor built and shaped over 70 years, and to do it with dignity and with purpose, and with the knowledge that you are always, in some way, being measured against an absence. To come around a corner and see a dog that once ran through rooms you're now responsible for. To stop, to feel it, to let yourself feel it briefly in public where anyone might be watching. That takes a kind of courage that doesn't get mentioned much. It's not the obvious kind. It's not the kind you get medals for. It's just the quiet human courage of allowing yourself to be affected by something. I found Sandy later that morning. Or rather, a member of the household staff found Sandy, and I saw the finding happen. This is a distinction my editor would probably want me to make. The dog had wandered a little further down the path, still following whatever invisible thread she'd been following since whatever had caused her to be here in the first place. She was sniffing at the base of an ornamental shrub with the focused, businesslike manner of a dog who considers this investigation extremely important. The household staff member, a young woman, sensible shoes, a kind face, crouched down and spoke to Sandy in a low voice, and Sandy looked up from the shrub with the mild surprise of someone interrupted mid-sentence, and then allowed herself to be gently redirected. They walked off together, the young woman and the dog, toward the side entrance. At the corner, Sandy paused. She turned and looked back at the path behind her. At the gravel, at the gate, at the guard standing exactly where he'd always been standing. Then she turned again and walked on. I spoke to people afterward. This is the part of the job that requires the most delicacy, finding people who saw what you saw and getting them to say something honest about it. The two northern girls were the easiest. They were still nearby, near a hot drinks stand, and they were happy to talk. One of them had filmed part of it on her phone, she told me, but she'd stopped because it felt wrong. It didn't seem right to film that part, she said, and her friend nodded. Some things you're just supposed to watch properly. I liked that a great deal. I wrote it down. The man in the orange waterproof jacket I didn't find again. The older man, the white-haired one, the telegraph reader, I found him sitting on a bench near the path, not far from where we'd both been standing. He had a takeaway coffee in both hands, and he was looking at nothing in particular. I introduced myself, told him what I did, asked if I could ask him a few questions. He thought about it, took a sip of his coffee. Then he said, "She loved those dogs, the Queen did. Everyone knows that. But it's one thing to know a fact and another thing to see it standing in front of you." I asked him what he meant. He looked at me for a moment like he wasn't entirely sure I'd understood the story I'd just watched. "The dog went to the guard," he said. "Not to anyone else, not to her, to the guard first, and the guard let her." He paused. "That's not nothing," he said. "That's really not nothing. I've thought about that a lot. About why Sandy went to Whitmore first. The obvious answer is the simplest one. Dogs go where they're drawn, and they're often drawn by something invisible to us, some combination of scent and sound and posture that we don't have the equipment to detect. Maybe he smelled like someone familiar. Maybe the sound of his breathing, perfectly controlled, had some quality that the dog found reassuring. Maybe it was pure chance, the right location, the right moment, the dog in motion and the guard in stillness, and the two things meeting at that point on the path. But the less obvious answer, the one I keep coming back to, is something about what a royal guard represents. These men and women stand at the boundary. That's the job in its most fundamental form. They stand at the line between the public and the private, between the outside world and the interior of something that is very carefully protected. They're not there just to be photographed, not just to be part of the spectacle, though they are part of it. They're there because some things need to be guarded. Some spaces need someone standing at the edge of them, holding the line. Sandy had lived her whole life inside that protected space. She'd grown up in palaces. She'd run through the corridors of Balmoral and walked the grounds of Windsor and slept in rooms that most people will never see. She'd been part of the interior. And when she found herself on the outside, on the public path in the gray morning, uncertain of the scent, she walked toward the guard. Toward the person standing at the boundary. toward the thing that means. Here is where something worth protecting begins. I don't know if that's too much weight to put on a dog's choice of direction. It probably is, but I keep thinking it anyway. Corporal James Whitmore finished his duty that morning without incident. He was rotated out at the appropriate time. He walked off the post in the appropriate manner. He didn't talk to anyone about what had happened, as far as I was able to determine, not to other guards, not to anyone else. Or if he did, nobody I spoke to had heard it. He just did his job. He stood his post. He allowed a moment to happen that needed to happen, and then he continued. I found out weeks later that he had a photograph somewhere, not taken by him, not taken that morning, a different photograph, the official kind, that had been sent to him through the proper channels. A photograph of that section of the path, taken by one of the official photographers during a different event, with the gate and the gravel and the exact spot where he always stood. He'd apparently put it somewhere at home. I don't know why I find that affecting, but I do. The piece I wrote for the publication was not about this. That's the truth of it. I wrote the piece I was commissioned to write, the changing of the guard, the tourists, the ceremony, the heritage. I did my job. The piece ran about 6 weeks later, and my editor was pleased with it, and it got a reasonable response. I didn't write about that morning. I didn't write about Sandy or Whitmore or Camilla's face when she saw the dog or the nod or the 40 seconds. Partly because I couldn't verify enough of it to meet the standards the publication holds. Partly because some of the people involved hadn't consented to being written about. Partly because, and I know this sounds strange for a writer to say, some things don't need to be in a magazine. Some things are fine just being what they were. True without needing documentation, real without needing an audience. But I've been carrying it around since then. The way you carry something that meant more to you than you entirely understand. So I'm telling it now, not as a verified account of events, not as something that went through an editorial process and a fact-checking process and a legal review, just as what I saw, what I was there for, what I can say with certainty happened. A dog walked toward a guard on a gray morning in London. A woman saw the dog and stopped. A guard stood still, and in his stillness allowed something to occur that needed to occur. And the morning held it all, the mist and the gravel and the thin winter sun arriving through the cloud. And then it moved on, the way mornings do. There are dogs now at the palace at the various residences. Life continues. New things come. But somewhere in the official record of that building, somewhere in the accumulated weight of what has happened within those walls and on those paths, there is the fact of a Corgi who walked down a public path one morning and chose a guard. And a guard who held his ground. And a woman who let herself be stopped. Some days I think that's the whole story, right there in those three things. The dog, the guard, the woman. The small tug of one lost thing finding its way, briefly, to a place where it recognized something. The queen is gone, but her dog walked through the morning. And for 40 seconds, something of her walked with it. I still think about the way Sandy sat down next to him, not hurried, not anxious, just decided. The way animals sometimes seem to know exactly where they're supposed to be and go there without any of the self-doubt we spend our whole lives swimming through. She sat down. She looked out at the path ahead. She was calm. I think that's what I'll remember longest. Not the nod, not the crowd, not the breaking mist. Just the dog and her decision, and how settled she looked once she'd made it.